She was 22 years old, raising 4 children that weren't hers to raise, holding a ranch together with bleeding hands and a breaking heart, and the whole town was waiting for her to fail. What happens when everything you love is slipping through your fingers, and the only person willing to reach out is a stranger you don't know how to trust? This is Evelyn Hart's story, a woman forged in fire, tested by frost, and saved by something she never saw coming. Drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. I want to see how far this story travels. The ground was still half frozen when they buried Margaret Hart. They laid her next to her husband, Thomas, whose grave had barely settled from the month before. The soil still loose, still dark, still smelling of turned earth rather than the dry Montana dust that coated everything else on the property. 2 wooden crosses. 2 names. 2 people who were supposed to still be alive. Evelyn stood at the edge of the graves and did not cry. She had done her crying already, in the dark, with her face pressed into a flour sack so the younger ones wouldn't hear her through the thin walls of the cabin. She'd cried until her chest ached and her eyes swelled shut, and then she'd gotten up before dawn, built the fire, and started the oatmeal because someone had to. That someone was always her now. Behind her, she could hear the shuffling of small boots in the dirt. Clara, who was 9 and trying very hard to be brave, stood straight-backed and rigid beside 8-year-old James, who had given up on being brave entirely and was crying quietly into his sleeve. The twins, Nora and Samuel, both 6, didn't fully understand what a grave meant yet. They kept looking around at the open sky, at the hawks circling in the distance, at anything that wasn't the 2 crosses planted in the earth. Pastor Hicks from town had said a few words. Short ones. He had other calls to make. When the small gathering dispersed, the Calloway family from the neighboring spread, old Pete Larkin, who'd worked with Thomas on and off for years, the mercantile owner's wife who'd brought a covered dish that nobody would end up eating, Evelyn stayed behind. She stood there with the wind pulling at her dark hair and her hands folded in front of her, looking at her mother's name scratched into pine. Margaret Ann Hart, beloved wife and mother, 1844 to 1882, 38 years old. That's all she'd gotten. Evelyn. Clara's voice was careful, like she was testing whether the ground would hold. We should go inside. Samuel's getting cold. Evelyn turned around. The 4 of them were standing in a loose cluster a few feet away, watching her with the particular look of children who have just discovered that the adults are gone, and there is only one person left who might know what to do. It was a look that would become very familiar to her in the months ahead, hopeful and frightened in equal measure. Waiting. Yeah, she said. Come on. The Hart Ranch sat on 43 acres of Montana grassland, threaded through with a creek that ran clear in summer and froze solid in winter. Thomas Hart had homesteaded it 15 years ago with a wagon, a mule, a young wife, and the particular brand of stubborn optimism that drove men to plant themselves in unforgiving land and dare it to push them out. It had pushed back. Hard. There'd been good years scattered through the bad ones, years when the cattle came in fat and the grass ran green and Thomas would sit on the porch in the evening with a satisfied look on his face, like a man who had won an argument with the earth itself. But there'd been more bad years than good ones lately, and Thomas hadn't been as strong as he used to be, and then the fever came in February and took him in 12 days. Margaret followed 6 weeks later, her body simply refusing to carry on without him. The ranch they left behind was not the healthy, thriving thing that Evelyn remembered from childhood. She found this out in pieces, the way you discover rot in a fence post. Not all at once, but board by board until you stand back and realize the whole thing is compromised. First, it was the account ledger, which she'd never been allowed to look at before, because Thomas handled the money, and that was simply the way things were. She sat at the kitchen table the night after the funeral with a candle and her father's leather-bound ledger and worked through the columns until her eyes burned. The numbers were not good. There was a note on the ranch, $340 owed to the Harlan County Savings Bank, with payments due on the 1st of every month. There were smaller debts scattered through town, $11 to the feed store, $7 to the blacksmith, $22 to Calloway's brother-in-law who'd come out to repair the roof of the main barn last fall. There was almost no cash left because Thomas had spent the winter months buying hay to feed the cattle through the cold, and what little he'd saved had gone toward medicine when the fever came. Against this, Evelyn counted her assets. 31 head of cattle, some in better shape than others. 4 horses, one old, one young and half broken, 2 that worked reliably if you knew how to handle them. A small flock of chickens. The 43 acres, worth something on paper, but worth nothing unless you could work it. And the house, which needed a new roof on the east side. And the south fence, which had 3 sections down from the winter. And the water pump, which made a sound like a dying cat and produced about half what it should. She closed the ledger and sat in the dark for a while. Then she got up, banked the fire, checked on the children, and went to bed. There was nothing else to do that night, and tomorrow would come whether she was ready for it or not. Tet. The first month was the worst. Evelyn had grown up on the ranch and knew the work, but knowing something and doing it alone were 2 entirely different things. Thomas had always had Pete Larkin helping when the big jobs came around, and before that he'd had men from town he could hire out when the cattle needed branding or the hay needed cutting. Evelyn had neither the money for hired help nor the luxury of asking favors from people she barely knew, so she did it herself. She was up before light every morning to feed and water the cattle, breaking ice off the water trough with the back of an axe. She split wood in the early dark, her arms aching, her breath coming in clouds. She rode out to check the fence lines on a horse that was still learning to trust her, and she came back in the early afternoon to start the cooking and the laundry and the mending, because the children still needed to eat and wear clean clothes and have someone look at them as though everything was going to be all right. Clara helped. She was a serious, capable girl who had watched her mother run a household and absorbed it the way some children absorb everything, quietly, without making a fuss about it. She took over the cooking on the mornings Evelyn was too tired to stand upright, and she washed the younger children's hair and read to them at night from the Bible, because it was the only book they had, even though Evelyn sometimes heard her substituting her own words when the passages got too dark. James was harder. He was the kind of boy who went inward when things were bad, who retreated into silence and went through his days like a small, pale ghost, doing what was asked of him without protest and without presence. Evelyn would catch him sometimes standing at the window looking at nothing, and she didn't know how to reach him, and she was usually too tired to try as hard as she should have. The twins were simply too young to understand what had happened. They asked for their mother for the first 2 weeks, and then they gradually stopped, and that was almost worse. Evelyn moved through those early months like a person operating at the edge of what was possible. She slept less than she should have. She ate less than she should have because when food was short, she made sure the children had enough before she thought about herself. She lost weight she couldn't spare. The dark circles under her eyes became permanent features of her face. She did not ask for help. This was partly pride, the particular pride of a family that had always stood on its own feet and believed that asking for charity was a kind of surrender, and it was partly something harder to name, a bone-deep suspicion that if she let herself lean on anything, it might give way, and she would fall with it, so she stood on her own. Barely, sometimes, but upright. The first serious blow came in April. Old Pete Larkin showed up at the fence line while she was restringing wire, his hat in his hands and his eyes somewhere around her boots. "Miss Evelyn," he said, "I'm real sorry about your folks." "Thank you, Pete." "I wanted to. I've been meaning to come sooner." He turned his hat around by the brim, a slow rotation. "The thing is, my sister over in Billings, she's taken sick, bad sick. I need to go look after her, and I don't know for how long." Evelyn looked at him. Pete was 63 years old and had been part of the fabric of the Hart Ranch for as long as she could remember. He'd taught her to ride. He'd fixed things when Thomas was too busy to fix them himself. He didn't work for wages anymore. He hadn't for years. But he showed up, and showing up counted for more than most people understood. "Of course," she said. "Go take care of your sister." "I hate to leave you with—" "Pete," she kept her voice steady. "It's all right. I'll manage." He went, and she stood alone at the fence line and looked at the distance between her and the next post, and thought about how many more there were after that. "I'll manage." She'd said it so many times it was starting to sound like something she said because she had no other option, which was exactly what it was. By June, the cattle were getting thin. The spring grass should have been enough to carry them, but it had been a dry spring, and the back pasture where Thomas had always sent the herd for the early grazing season was down to patches. Evelyn was supplementing with hay from the dwindling supply in the barn watching the bales disappear with a cold arithmetic that kept her awake at night. She did the math over and over, in the dark, lying in the bed that still somehow smelled like her parents'. The math did not improve with repetition. She needed to sell cattle, but she needed the cattle to work the ranch. But if she didn't sell some, she'd run out of feed money before fall. But if she sold too many, she'd have nothing to build back from. She put it off. And then she put it off some more. Meanwhile, James got sick in late June. Not seriously, just a summer fever that burned for 3 days and left him pale and shaky. And the medicine cost her $4 she didn't have. She pulled it from the envelope she'd been saving for the mortgage payment and told herself she'd make it up somehow. She didn't know how. The town of Harlan was 8 miles east on a road that was fine in dry weather and treacherous in everything else. Evelyn went in once a month when she could, twice when she had to. She loaded the wagon with whatever she had to sell. Eggs, sometimes a dressed chicken, once a pair of her mother's good embroidered pillowcases that she held on to as long as she could before necessity won, and traded what she had for what she needed. She was not a woman who talked much in town. She answered questions directly and asked for things specifically, and did not linger over coffee and gossip the way other women did. People in Harlan knew her situation in the vague way that small towns knew things. The Hart girl lost both parents, raising those little ones, and they were not unkind about it. But they also kept a distance that she couldn't entirely blame them for, because her situation was serious enough to make people uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to look too long at someone who was failing. She was not failing. She told herself this regularly. But she was close enough to it that the difference was sometimes hard to articulate. The day she walked into Callaway's Mercantile and stood at the counter with her list in her hand and the wrong amount of money in her pocket was a Tuesday in the middle of July. And it was the kind of hot that made the air shimmer over the road and put everyone in a foul temper. She had $6.20. Her list totaled $8.55. She stood at the counter and looked at the numbers she'd written down beside each item: flour, salt, sugar, kerosene, a box of rifle cartridges for whatever game she could find, a piece of oilcloth she needed to patch the section of roof over the twins' bedroom before the rains came, and did the arithmetic for the 4th time, hoping it would change. It didn't. Miss Hart, Dan Calloway's voice was cautious. He'd known Evelyn since she was 12 years old, and he had the look of a man who knew bad news was coming and wanted to be somewhere else. "You all right?" "I'm short," she said. It cost her something to say it. Not everything, but something. "I can come back for the kerosene and the oilcloth when I have more." "Evelyn." He dropped the formal address he usually maintained. "Your family's been trading here a long time. I know that, but I'm not asking for credit. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering credit. There's a difference." She looked at him. "How much are you carrying already for the ranch?" A pause. $11. From when your daddy bought that last load of seed corn. She looked back at her list. "I'll take the oilcloth. Leave the kerosene." She could fix the roof. She couldn't do much without light. She was counting out coins on the counter, organizing them in careful rows, when she heard the door open behind her and felt the slight shift in air from the summer heat outside. She didn't look up. 3 pounds of coffee, if you've got it, and whatever passes for decent jerky in this part of the territory. A man's voice, unhurried, not from Harlan. She knew everyone in Harlan, and this wasn't any of them. "Just got a new shipment," Dan said, his voice brightening in the way it did with good-paying customers. "Where you coming from, friend?" "Brennan's the name, Colt Brennan. Just signed on with the double H spread out east." Evelyn finished counting her coins and pushed them toward Dan. She picked up the oilcloth and the other items she'd set aside and started loading them into her canvas bag. She did not ask why a man from the double H was buying his own supplies rather than drawing from the ranch's stock. She did not ask anything because it was not her business, and she was in a hurry to get back before the children needed her. She was halfway to the door when her head swam. It was not dramatic. It was not a faint or a stumble or anything that would make a story worth telling. It was just a sudden dizziness, the kind that comes from not eating enough that morning and standing in a hot room and the particular weight of a very hard few months. And she put her hand on the door frame and waited for it to pass. It didn't pass quite fast enough. "Ma'am?" She turned. The man who'd been talking to Dan Calloway was standing a few feet away, close enough to have reached her quickly if she'd actually gone down, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not pity and was not alarm. It was something quieter than both of those. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the particular build that came from years of actual physical work, rather than the borrowed muscles of men who pretended at it. He had dark hair under a battered hat, and eyes that were some shade of brown she couldn't quite pin down in the dim light of the mercantile. He was probably a few years older than her, 25, maybe 26, and he had the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outside. "I'm fine," she said. "Sure." He didn't move. "But if you're not, there's a bench right over there." I said, "I'm fine." She straightened, adjusted the bag on her arm, and looked him directly in the face so he'd know she meant it. "Thank you for your concern." She walked out into the July heat. She made it to the wagon without any further difficulty, loaded her bag, and climbed up into the seat. Her hands on the reins were steady enough. She told herself she'd eat something when she got home. She did not look back at the mercantile. She ate a biscuit on the road, pulling it from the bag she'd packed that morning for exactly this kind of situation. She'd learned, after one bad week in May, that she could not afford to go to town and come back empty-stomached. It helped. The dizziness retreated to somewhere manageable, and by the time she turned the wagon down the lane toward the ranch, she felt like herself again. Whatever herself was these days. The children were in the yard when she arrived. Clara had them doing something organized, some project that involved sticks and string that Evelyn didn't have the energy to ask about. They looked up when she came in, and the twins ran over, and for a moment she let herself just sit in the wagon seat and look at them. 4 of them. Dark hair. All of them. Like their father's side of the family. Clara with her serious mouth. James, still too thin from the June illness, watching her from the shadow of the barn door. Nora, who had a smear of something that was probably mud across her cheek. Samuel, already pulling at the side of the wagon to see what she'd brought. "Did you get sugar?" Samuel asked. He was 6 and had the priorities of a 6-year-old. "Some," she said. "Can we have biscuits with sugar tonight?" asked Clara. She climbed down from the wagon and started unloading, and the particular rhythm of the afternoon took her in. Unpack, put away, start supper, check on the cattle, come back, supervise washing, put the little ones to bed. It was only later, when the house was quiet and the candle was burning low, that she let herself think about the numbers again. The mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks. She was short, not catastrophically, not by $100, but by enough that she couldn't simply pull it from savings because there was no savings. She'd need to sell something. She looked around the room, her mother's good tablecloth embroidered with blue flowers, the second best set of china, the silver candlesticks that had come over from the family back east. She made a list. She put numbers next to the items. She compared the numbers to what she needed. Then she folded the paper and put it in the ledger and went to bed. She did not sleep well. The cattle needed moving in the second week of July. The back pasture was genuinely finished, grazed down to bare patches in most places. And she needed to get the herd to the North Creek section, which required moving them through a gate and along a fence line and across the low spot by the creek that turned to mud in wet seasons, and was only reliable this year because it had been so dry. This was a job for 2 people, minimum. Pete was still in Billings. She had no one to ask. The Calloways had their own operation to run, and she was already uncomfortable with how much she'd needed to lean on their goodwill. She tried to do it herself. She got the cattle moving well enough. She'd helped with drives before, and she had a good horse and reasonable instincts, but 31 head of cattle required attention at both the front and back of the movement, and she was one person on one horse, and when the older bull decided he didn't want to go through the gate, the whole thing started to unravel. She was chasing the bull back toward the fence. She'd had to dismount to open the gate and hadn't had time to get back on. When the younger heifers at the back of the herd lost direction and started spreading into the rough scrub at the edge of the pasture, she stood in the middle of the field for a moment, looking from the bull to the heifers and back again, and felt something in her chest that was not quite despair and not quite anger, something that had no good name. She went after the bull first, because he outweighed everything else and would be harder to retrieve if he got into the timber. She got him through the gate eventually. It took 45 minutes, during which the heifers spread themselves across 40 yards of scrubland and had to be individually gathered. By the time the herd was through and the gate was shut, she was sweating through her dress. One of her boots was soaked from stepping in a soft spot by the creek, and she had a scratch along her forearm from the scrub brush that was starting to sting. She sat down in the dirt by the fence post. Just for a minute. She sat there in the July heat with her knees pulled up and her arms resting on them, and looked at the cattle grazing peacefully in the north section as if they hadn't just spent an hour making her life a misery, and she thought, I don't know how long I can do this. Not as a defeat, more as an observation, a fact she'd been circling around for months that she was finally willing to look at directly. She could do it today. She was doing it. But she was doing it at a cost she couldn't calculate yet, and there was going to come a point where the account was empty, and she didn't know what she'd do then. She got up after a few minutes, caught her horse, and rode back to the ranch. There was supper to start. The next morning she woke before dawn as usual and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the house. The twins' quiet breathing from the other room, the occasional pop of the wood settling in the walls, a coyote somewhere far off. She went over her list the way she did every morning. What needed to be done? What could wait? What couldn't? The south fence still had 2 sections down. The pump was getting worse. She'd been hauling water from the creek for the house, which added an hour to her morning that she didn't have. The roof patch she'd put on the twins' room with the oilcloth was holding, but barely. She needed to get to the feed store, but the feed store required money, and the money required selling something, and she was working up to having that conversation with herself. She got dressed in the dark, pulled on her boots, the one from yesterday was still damp at the toe, and went downstairs to start the fire. She was standing at the stove, coaxing the kindling to catch, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She didn't think much of it. People used the road. She went back to the fire, got it going, put the kettle on, and was measuring out oatmeal when the hoofbeats slowed and then stopped somewhere near the front of the property. She put down the oatmeal tin and went to the window. A single rider had come to a stop at the end of the lane, looking at the property. He sat very still on his horse in the early gray light, and she couldn't see his face clearly from here. Just the shape of him, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, and something about the stillness of him that wasn't quite the stillness of a man who was lost or looking for directions. He was looking at the fence. She watched him for a moment, then she went to the door and opened it. "Can I help you?" she called. He turned the horse and came up the lane at an easy walk, and as he got closer, she recognized him with a small, surprised jolt. The man from the Mercantile. Colt Brennan, he'd said. From the Double H. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Hart," he said, "you know my name. Dan Calloway mentioned it." He looked at her directly, not rudely, but steadily, the way some men looked when they were used to weighing things up and didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. "I'm not here to bother you. I was just riding the road and I saw your south fence." She waited. "I got tools," he said. "Fencing wire, post driver. I could fix those 2 sections in a couple hours." "Why would you do that?" A pause. He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she hadn't expected. Most men, when they offered something, got either defensive or performative when you questioned the offer. He just sat there on his horse and thought about it. "Because it needs doing," he said finally, "and I'm not busy until noon." "I can't pay you." "I'm not asking to be paid." She looked at him. At the fence. At the distance between here and where she'd need to haul tools from. At the time it would take, added against everything else that needed doing today. "I don't take charity," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation, exactly. More like the small adjustment a man makes when he realizes he's approached something the wrong way. "It's not charity," he said. "If it was, I'd have brought a basket of food and knocked on your front door. This is—" He looked at the fence. "This is just a neighbor thing. I'll be working the Double H spread this season, and your south line borders their property eventually. Loose cattle don't respect county lines." It was a practical argument. It was the kind of argument she could accept. "There's coffee on," she said, "if you want some before you start." That'd be appreciated. He dismounted, tied his horse to the post by the gate, and followed her inside. He drank his coffee at the kitchen table while she finished making the oatmeal, and they didn't talk much. Clara came downstairs first, took one look at the stranger at the table, and looked at Evelyn with a question in her eyes that Evelyn answered with a small headshake that meant, "It's fine, don't make anything of it." Clara served herself oatmeal and sat at the far end of the table and read the almanac, which was the only thing she read besides the Bible. James came down, stopped dead in the doorway, and then recovered himself and sat down without saying anything. He had the wary, watchful quality that had been in him since their father died. Not hostile exactly, but measuring everything, deciding whether to trust it. The twins came tumbling down together, as they always did, and Samuel immediately asked the stranger who he was. "Colt Brennan," the man said, without making a production of it. "Are you fixing our fence?" Samuel asked. "Planning to." "Papa used to fix the fence," Samuel said, in the way that 6-year-olds sometimes drop things into conversations, without drama, without apparent awareness that what they've just said might land differently on different people in the room. A small silence. "Your papa taught you right," Colt said. "Fence has got to be maintained. It's the bones of a ranch." Samuel appeared satisfied with this and turned his attention to his oatmeal. Evelyn looked at Colt. He was looking at his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it, and if the comment about the father had landed on him in any particular way, he wasn't showing it. She thought, he knows how to be around people who are hurting without making it into something. It was a rare quality. She'd seen it in almost no one. "I'll show you where the post pounder is," she said, "before you head out." He worked for 3 hours on the south fence while she did the morning's chores. She could see him from the north pasture when she rode out to check on the cattle, just the distant shape of him, working steadily, no wasted motion. He'd brought his own wire, she saw, coiled on the back of his saddle. She hadn't asked where it came from. She'd decided, somewhere between the kitchen and the pasture gate, that she could accept a man fixing a fence without knowing every particular of why. The twins found him around mid-morning, which was inevitable. They had no sense of strangers and thought everyone who appeared on the property was there for their personal entertainment. She could see them from a distance, 2 small figures attaching themselves to the tall one at the fence line, and she thought about calling them back and didn't. Let them be normal children for an hour. Let someone else deal with the questions. When she rode back in at noon, the fence was done. 2 sections repaired, posts set solid, wire strung taut and even. She got off her horse and walked the line and ran her gloved hand along the wire, testing the tension. Good work. Better than she'd have done, honestly, with the post driver she had. Colt was packing up his tools. The twins were sitting on the fence rail watching him, and Samuel was telling him something with great seriousness and elaborate hand gestures. And then the coyote came back the next night, and Evelyn sat up all night with the rifle and scared it off. And in the morning there was a dead chicken by the hen house, and Clara cried, but she didn't tell Evelyn she cried because Evelyn was already so tired. "Samuel," Evelyn said. Samuel looked at her. "What?" "Help Nora down off the fence before she falls." She looked at Colt. "Fence looks good. Should hold through the season." He tied the last of his tools to his saddlebag and straightened up. "You've got a couple of posts on the east line that'll need replacing before winter. They're not urgent yet." "I know." She'd been putting it on her list every week. "Thank you. For the wire. I'll replace it." "Don't." He said it simply, without making a debate of it. It was going spare. She had about 4 different arguments lined up behind her teeth. She let them go. "All right," she said. He swung up onto his horse. He looked down at her for a moment in that same steady way he'd had at the mercantile, like he was looking at what was actually there rather than what he expected to see. "Miss Hart," he said, "I'll be riding this road regular. If something comes up that needs doing, I manage fine." "I know you do." He said it without any particular inflection, and she couldn't tell if it was agreement or something else. "I'm just saying, if something comes up." He touched his hat again and rode back down the lane. She stood in the dust and watched him go, one hand on the fence post he'd set, solid as bedrock in the ground. The twins came and stood beside her, one on each side. "I like him," Nora announced. "You just met him," Evelyn said. "I know." Nora leaned against her. "I still like him." Evelyn put her arm around the girl without thinking about it, which was how she did most things with the little ones. Without thinking, because if she started thinking, she'd think about how impossible it all was, and she didn't have time for that. "Come on," she said. "Lunch!" He came back the following week. She heard the horse on the road at mid-morning and kept working, and then heard it slow at the lane, and then the sound of it coming up toward the house. And she set down the bucket she was carrying and waited. Miss Hart. Mr. Brennan. He had a length of iron pipe across his saddle and a look on his face like a man who'd thought of something practical. Your pump, he said. She looked at him. What about it? Sounds like it's got a cracked fitting at the base where it meets the casing. I've heard it when I ride past. He held up the pipe. I've got a fitting that might work. How have you heard my pump from the road? Sound carries in dry weather. He dismounted. You want me to look at it or not? She wanted to say no. The word was right there, ready. It's around back, she said instead. The fitting worked. It took him 40 minutes, during which she brought him a glass of water and stood near enough to watch what he was doing without appearing to watch. James drifted out of the barn at some point and stood at a distance, hands in his pockets, watching too. When Colt worked the pump handle and got a strong, clean stream of water, the sound of it was different. Even she could hear that. Better? He asked. Much better, she admitted. James was still standing there. Colt looked at him. You want to try it? James shrugged, but he came over and worked the handle and watched the water come out, and something moved across his face that Evelyn hadn't seen in months. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one. How does it work? James asked. His voice was careful, testing whether conversation was something safe to attempt. Colt settled back on his heels and explained it. The piston and the cylinder and the leather cup that created the suction. In plain language, without talking down to the boy. James listened with his full attention, asking 2 or 3 questions, and Colt answered each one like it was a reasonable thing to want to know. Evelyn watched her brother's face. That evening, after supper, she sat at the table with the ledger and the folded paper with her lists on it and a new paper where she was trying to plan out the rest of the summer and fall. She'd been doing everything alone for so long that the math of alone had started to feel like the only math there was. You counted what you had. You subtracted what you needed. You tried to make the number come out right. What she hadn't accounted for was what happened when someone just showed up and fixed a fence and a pump and talked to a grieving boy like he was worth talking to. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She folded the papers, put them in the ledger, and closed the cover. Outside, the Montana summer evening was going orange at the edges of the sky, and somewhere down in the north pasture, the cattle were settling for the night, and the pump by the back of the house was quiet and whole and working the way it was supposed to. She sat there in the last light and listened to her brother tell Clara something. She couldn't hear the words, just the sound of his voice, which had more life in it than it had had in weeks, and felt something shift, very slightly, in the careful architecture of her survival. She didn't trust it yet, but she noticed it. He came back a third time on a Thursday, and she stopped pretending to be surprised. She was in the middle of churning butter when she heard the horse, and she kept churning, because the butter didn't care who was riding up the lane, and neither did the morning schedule. By the time Colt Brennan had tied his horse at the post and walked around to the side of the house where she was working, she had a full pound of butter nearly done, and her arms were aching from the handle. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She didn't look up from the churn. "If you've come to fix something else, I'd like to know about it ahead of time." A pause. "The hinge on your barn door, left side. It's going to pull out of the frame before the month's out." She had noticed the hinge. She'd been noticing it for 2 weeks, moving it down the list every time something more urgent pushed past it. "I'll get to it," she said. "I've got 30 minutes. She looked up then. He was standing a few feet away with his hat in his hands, and there was something in his expression that was different from the first 2 times. Less certain, maybe. Like a man who'd been doing a thing and had only just now started to wonder if he ought to be. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked. It wasn't an unfriendly question. It was the question she'd been carrying around for a week, and she was tired of carrying it. He turned his hat once around by the brim, that same unconscious habit she'd noticed in Dan Calloway, and in her father once, the thing men did when they were working up to something honest. "I don't have a good answer that doesn't sound like something," he said. "Then give me the bad one." He looked at her. "I ride past every day on the way to the Double H, and every day there's something that needs doing that I can see from the road. And I know you're in there doing 10 things at once with 4 kids to look after, and—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not trying to make you feel like you owe me anything. I I can't ride past and not stop. She went back to the churn. 3 more pulls, and the butter broke the way it was supposed to. The hinge is on the left side, she said. There's a toolbox inside the barn door. Second shelf. He fixed the hinge in 20 minutes. She brought him a second cup of coffee when he was done, and they stood in the yard while he drank it, and she asked him how he'd ended up at the Double H. Came up from Wyoming, he said. Worked a spread down there for 4 years, but the owner sold out last fall, and the new owners brought their own men. Heard the Double H was hiring, so here I am. You got family in Wyoming? No. He said it simply, without closing a door on it the way some men did, like family was a wound they didn't want touched. It was more like a fact. You? My parents' people are all back east, Massachusetts, mostly. We haven't been in touch much. She looked at the barn. My mother used to write to her sister. I don't know if her sister knows yet. You could write to her. I've been meaning to. She hadn't. She didn't know how to begin that letter, how to explain what the last 4 months had been, how to make a woman she'd never met understand that the family she'd left behind when she married Thomas Hart had come down to 5 children in a ranch that was barely holding together. Colt didn't push it. He finished his coffee and handed back the cup. I'll be back Saturday, he said. If that's all right. She looked at him for a moment. You're not working Saturday? Half day. I'm off by noon. She thought about saying no. She thought about the particular pride she'd been carrying since February, the way it had kept her upright when everything else wanted to knock her down, and how it had also made her refuse help that she needed and push away people who meant well until she'd ended up so alone that the loneliness had become its own kind of weight. If you come Saturday, she said, you're eating lunch here. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, just a slight softening around the eyes that she was beginning to recognize as the version of a smile he actually used. All right, he said. Saturday became a pattern the way patterns form in dry places, quietly, without announcement, until you look down one day and see the groove worn into the earth and realize how many times you must have walked that same path. He came on Saturdays and sometimes on Thursday mornings when his work at the Double H allowed. He fixed things. He stayed for meals when she offered, and she offered more consistently as the weeks went on, because she'd noticed that the children ate better when there was someone else at the table, that the presence of a calm, ordinary adult seemed to loosen something in them, let them be children rather than small people braced for the next disaster. Clara warmed to him slowly, which was her way with everything. She watched him the first 3 Saturdays from a careful distance, and then on the 4th one she appeared at his elbow while he was working on the water trough and asked him a question about wood joinery that he probably hadn't expected, and he answered it, and they had a 20-minute conversation that Evelyn watched from the kitchen window with her hand still in the biscuit dough and a feeling in her chest that was too complicated to look at directly. James was the one she'd been most worried about. He was 10 years old and the only boy, and he'd been carrying the weight of that in a way she hadn't known how to address. The way he'd taken on a kind of grim seriousness, like he'd decided that someone had to be the man of the family, and it was going to be him even if it killed him. Which it would, eventually, the way that kind of premature weight always did. Colt didn't treat James like a substitute adult. He didn't tell him he was the man of the family or that he needed to be strong. He just talked to him like a boy who happened to be interested in how things worked, which James was, desperately, and which no one had had much time to address. He started teaching James how to rope, not in any formal way. He just showed up one Saturday with a spare lasso and spent an hour in the yard demonstrating the basic throw, and James took to it the way some kids took to certain things, with immediate total absorption. By the 3rd Saturday, James could hit the fence post reliably from 15 feet, and he walked around for the rest of that day with the rope coiled over his shoulder and his chin slightly elevated. Evelyn saw it and felt something loosen in her chest. She didn't say thank you to Colt directly. She didn't know how to do it without it becoming too much, without the gratitude tipping over into something that scared her. Instead, she made sure his coffee was hot when he arrived, and she put the extra piece of pie in front of him at supper, and when he fixed something she'd been worrying about, she said that's good work rather than I could have managed the way she'd said in the early weeks. It was a small shift, but it was real. The problem was the town. Harlan was not a large place. It had 1 main street, 2 saloons, a church, a school that ran through April and stopped in summer when the children were needed for farm work, and the particular social ecosystem of small frontier communities where everyone's business was everyone else's business and was managed accordingly. Evelyn had always existed on the edge of this ecosystem. She was not unfriendly, but she was not a woman who sought company, and the ranch being 8 miles out had always given her a natural excuse for limited involvement in town affairs. People knew her. They were generally decent to her. But people talked. She heard about it first from Clara, who'd been in town with her for a supply run in early August and had caught fragments of a conversation between two women outside the dry goods store that she wasn't supposed to hear. Clara reported it in her matter-of-fact way, sitting across the kitchen table from Evelyn that evening, with her hands folded and her expression neutral. Mrs. Alderman was talking to Mrs. Fletcher, she said. They said there was a man coming to the ranch regular, and Mrs. Alderman said it wasn't proper for a single woman in your position to be— She paused, selecting her words. To be encouraging a strange man on the property. Evelyn looked at her. What did you do? I kept walking. A beat. But I heard Mrs. Fletcher say she didn't blame you. She'd heard the Hart Ranch was in a bad way, and it made sense you'd need— Clara's voice was careful now. She said you'd need a man to keep things from falling apart. The kitchen was quiet. The twins were already in bed. James was on the porch with his rope, practicing throws at the fence rail in the last evening light. What do you think? Evelyn asked. Clara was quiet for a moment, which was how she handled questions she was actually thinking about. I think Mr. Brennan fixed the fence and the pump and the barn door and taught James to rope, she said. And I think the ranch is better off than it was 2 months ago. She paused. I also think Mrs. Alderman has never had to figure out how to keep 4 people fed by herself. Evelyn looked at her 9-year-old sister and felt, not for the first time, that Clara was the most sensible person in the house. Get ready for bed, she said. And thank you. For what? For telling me. She didn't mention the town talk to Colt. It wasn't his problem to manage. But she found herself thinking about it in the way she thought about all the things she couldn't control, aware of it, circling it, trying to decide how much weight to give it. The town's opinion didn't feed the children or fix the fence, but the town was also where she bought supplies and borrowed credit and lived in the particular social proximity that small communities required, and its opinion of her was not nothing. The trouble was that the town's opinion was based on something real. Colt Brennan was not family. He was not a hired hand because she wasn't paying him. He was not, strictly speaking, anything she had a good word for, and in 1882 Montana, a man who didn't have a good word was a problem. She was turning this over one morning in mid-August, riding out to check the cattle, when she came up over the low ridge at the north end of the property and found Colt already there. He'd apparently been riding the property line, a thing he'd started doing without being asked, just the way he'd started doing everything, without asking permission and without making a production of it. And he'd stopped his horse at the top of the ridge and was looking at something in the north pasture. She rode up beside him. The cattle were fine. She followed his line of sight and saw what he was looking at, the creek, running lower than it had been last month, lower than it should be in August, even in a dry year. That's going to be a problem by September, he said. I know. She'd been watching it for 3 weeks. There's a spring on the east edge of the property that Thomas used one dry year before I was old enough to remember. He told me about it once. I don't know exactly where it is. Colt looked at her. You got any of his old survey maps? Maybe. In the chest in the back room, there's papers. He looked back at the creek. She looked at the side of his face. She'd been doing this more lately, noticing him. The particular way he sat on a horse, easy and balanced. The way he looked at problems, like they were things to be solved rather than obstacles to be endured. The fact that he was, in some undeniable way, steady, in a world that had been consistently unsteady since February, and that steadiness was something she was beginning to feel like she couldn't afford to want too much. I'll look for the maps tonight, she said. I'm off tomorrow afternoon. I could ride the east edge with you, see if we can find the spring. All right. She turned her horse back toward the house. He rode alongside her for a while without saying anything, which was one of the things she'd stopped finding strange. Most men she knew couldn't tolerate silence. They filled it up with words that didn't mean anything, and then more words, until silence became impossible. Colt seemed to understand that silence was sometimes the appropriate response to the landscape, to the work, to the particular quality of a morning that didn't require commentary. After a while, she said, "People in town are talking." "About what?" "About you being here." He was quiet for a moment. "What are they saying?" "That it's not proper, that I'm—" She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with caring what people thought of her, which she resented herself for. "That I'm in a bad position, and I'm doing what I have to do." The last part wasn't quite what Mrs. Fletcher had said, but it was what she'd heard in it. Colt pulled his horse up slightly so they were walking side by side, and she couldn't see his face from where she was. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Some." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I don't like being talked about." "No. But I also—" She stopped, started again. "I know what I'm doing and what I'm not doing, and that matters more to me than what Mabel Alderman thinks." She heard a quiet sound from him that might have been agreement or might have been something else. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm not here to cause you problems. I know that. And if people are going to talk, they're going to talk. Doesn't much change what needs to be done." She looked at him then. "No," she said, "it doesn't." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and she was glad of it. They found the spring the next afternoon. It was farther east than she'd expected, tucked into a fold of ground that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking, where a stand of cottonwoods had grown up around it and marked it with their unusual green against the dry summer hills. The ground around it was soft, which was how they finally located it. Colt's horse stepped into the soft ground and shied sideways, and they both looked down and then at the cottonwoods, and then at each other. "There it is," he said. They dismounted and crouched at the edge of the spring, and the water was clear and cold and coming up reliably from somewhere underground where the dry summer hadn't reached. Enough to supplement the creek. Enough to make the difference. James was with them. He'd been coming on these rides more often, trailing behind on the old reliable mare, listening to the conversations between Evelyn and Colt with the intensity of someone memorizing something important. He crouched down beside the spring and put his hand in the water. "Cold," he said. "Groundwater usually is," Colt said. "It doesn't get the sun down there." "How far down do you think it is?" "Hard to say. 20 feet? Could be more." James pulled his hand out and looked at the wet on his fingers. "Papa never showed me this." There was a pause. The cottonwood leaves moved overhead with a dry, papery sound. "He told Evelyn about it," Colt said. "That's how we knew to look." James looked at his sister. She was looking at the spring, at the water coming up clear from the dark earth, and her expression was the one she wore when something surprised her, not with happiness or sadness, but with the specific surprise of a world that was more complicated than expected. "He told you things," James said to her. It wasn't a question, more like something he was working out. "Some things," she said. "Not everything. He thought there was more time." James was quiet. Then he picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water and watched the ripples spread. "I want to know things," he said, "about the ranch, how things work. So if—" He stopped. "So if what?" Evelyn asked. "So if something happens. To you." His voice was very careful. "I want to know how to do it." She looked at her brother. 10 years old, throwing rocks into a spring, trying to prepare himself for a world that had already shown him it could take everything without warning. "Yeah," she said. "We'll work on that." She looked at Colt. He was looking at James with an expression she'd learned to recognize over the past months. Not pity, and not the performative kindness of someone who wanted credit for being kind. It was the look of a man who saw something worth seeing. He met her eyes briefly and then looked back at the spring. "We should trace a line from here to the north pasture," he said. "See if we can run a gravity feed." And they did, the three of them, walking the ground in the afternoon light, while James asked questions and Colt answered them, and Evelyn followed behind and thought about her father, who had known this spring was here and had carried the knowledge like a spare thing, something to fall back on, and had never imagined he wouldn't be there to use it. August ran into September the way hard months always did, not gradually but all at once, a change in the angle of light, and a bite in the early morning air that said summer was finished regardless of what the calendar claimed. The work shifted. The gravity feed from the spring was in, roughed in and functional if not elegant, enough to get water to the north pasture without hauling. The east fence line was repaired. The barn roof that had been worrying her since spring was patched properly, with real boards this time, not oilcloth. The woodpile was beginning to grow, not fast enough, but growing. None of this was because of Colt alone. She had done the work, but she had done it differently than she would have done it alone, which was to say, she had done it with enough energy left over to also do the cooking and the washing and the managing of 4 children and the bookkeeping that kept her up past midnight 2 nights a week. She was still tired. She was always tired, but it was a different quality of tired, less like a person running out of something irreplaceable and more like ordinary exhaustion, the kind that sleep could fix. This distinction mattered more than she could have explained to anyone. The mortgage payment in September went through on time for the first time since April. She'd managed it by selling 2 of the weaker heifers, a decision she'd agonized over, and that Colt had helped her think through on a Saturday afternoon in late August, laying out the options on the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, like a map of something they were navigating together. He had not made the decision for her. He'd laid out what he knew about cattle prices and billings, and what the timing meant for the herd, and then said, "What do you think?" and waited while she thought, and she'd realized partway through that she hadn't had anyone ask her that in months. Everyone in her life either needed her to decide things or assumed she already had. She sold the heifers. She made the payment. She sat in the kitchen that evening after the children were in bed and felt something that took her a moment to identify because it had been so long since she'd felt it. Relief. Temporary, fragile, contingent on everything continuing to go right, but real. It was Clara who noticed first. They were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, a rare slow morning because Colt wasn't coming and there were no particular emergencies demanding attention. And Clara was making biscuits while Evelyn worked through the week's accounting, and the twins were somewhere outside making whatever kind of trouble 6-year-olds made on cool September mornings. "Do you like him?" Clara asked. Evelyn didn't look up from the ledger. "Don't start." "I'm not starting anything. I'm asking." "He's been helpful." "I'm grateful." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn looked up then. Clara was cutting biscuit rounds with the tin cutter, not looking at her, her expression the same composed, attentive thing it always was. "You're 9 years old," Evelyn said. "I know what I am." Clara set down the cutter. "I see how you watch him when he's working, and I see how he looks at you when you're not looking." Evelyn put down her pen. "How does he look at me?" Clara considered this seriously. "Like you're the most interesting thing he's ever seen," she said, "but also like he's afraid to say so." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. "That's very observant for a 9-year-old, Evelyn said finally. "Mama used to say I watch too much and talk too little." Clara picked the cutter back up. "I always thought those were both compliments." Evelyn looked at her sister for a long moment, this small, serious girl who had watched both her parents die, and had kept making biscuits and reading almanacs and noticing things, and felt the complicated particular love that comes from taking care of someone who has also, in the ways that matter, been taking care of you. "He's a good man," she said. "I don't know what else he is yet." "Okay," Clara said. "That's an answer. Don't make it into something." "I'm not." She placed the last biscuit round on the pan. "I just think you're allowed to like him, that's all." Evelyn picked her pen back up. The numbers in the ledger looked back at her, patient and demanding. She didn't say anything else, and Clara didn't push it. But that afternoon when she was riding the fence line alone in the September light, she let herself think about what Clara had said, about the way he looked, about what that might mean, about the particular danger of allowing herself to need something that she wasn't sure she'd be able to keep. She'd had things taken from her. She knew exactly how fast that happened. And she knew that the worst time to want something was when you'd already lost almost everything, because the wanting itself became a kind of risk, another thing you could lose, and she had been managing risk for so long that she wasn't sure she remembered what it felt like to just want something and let that be enough. The horse moved under her at an easy walk. The grass ran gold in the afternoon sun, and the mountains to the west were starting to show the first faint traces of early color at the high elevations. She thought about the spring they'd found, about water that had been there the whole time, underground, cold and clear, waiting to be found. She rode back to the house as the first stars were appearing, put the horse up, and went inside to start supper. James was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, drawing something with great concentration. She looked over his shoulder. It was a rough diagram of the property. The pastures, the fence lines, the creek, and a small mark in the east corner that she recognized as the spring. He was mapping it, making it his to know. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly and went to the stove. Outside, the September wind was picking up, carrying the smell of the distant mountains, and somewhere in the north pasture, the cattle were moving, and the ranch was quiet and whole around her, imperfect and precarious, and held together with wire and stubbornness and the unexpected kindness of a man who couldn't ride past without stopping. She stirred the pot. The fire burned. The first hard frost came on a Wednesday in early October, and it came without the warning it was supposed to give. Evelyn woke to ice on the inside of the window panes, and a cold that had settled into the cabin like it intended to stay. She built the fire fast and went outside in the gray pre-dawn to check on the cattle, and found 3 of the younger calves huddled at the far end of the north pasture, separated from the herd sometime in the night, standing in the frost with their heads down and their breath coming in short clouds. She got them back to the main group without losing any, but it took 2 hours in the dark and cold, and by the time she came back inside, her hands were numb and her boots were wet through, and the twins were up and crying because they were hungry and the fire had gone down while she was out. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the cold stove and the 2 crying 6-year-olds and the ice still on the windows, and she thought, October. It's only October. There were 4 more months of winter ahead. She started the fire. She made the oatmeal. She got the twins settled, and then she sat down at the table with the ledger while they ate, and she looked at the numbers with the particular clarity that comes from having slept badly and woken to bad news. The cattle feed situation was the most urgent problem. She had enough hay in the barn to carry the herd through maybe 6 weeks of hard winter. 6 weeks was not enough. She needed more hay, and hay in October was expensive because everyone in the territory needed it at the same time, and she did not have the money to buy at October prices. She needed to sell more cattle, but if she sold more cattle, she'd have fewer animals come spring, which meant fewer calves, which meant less income next year, which meant... She closed the ledger. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed and composed as usual, her dark hair braided neatly. She looked at Evelyn's face, and then at the ledger, and then back at Evelyn's face. Bad? She asked. Getting there, Evelyn said. Colt showed up that Saturday, and she told him the situation without dressing it up. She'd stopped dressing things up around him somewhere in September. Had noticed one afternoon that she was explaining the ranch's finances to him with the same directness she used in her own head, without the careful editing she applied when other people asked, and had decided that this was either trust or exhaustion, and she didn't have the energy to figure out which. He listened without interrupting. They were standing at the barn door, both of them looking out at the north pasture where the frost-killed grass lay flat and brown, and he had his arms crossed and his hat pushed back slightly in the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. How many head can you afford to carry through winter? He asked. Realistically? 20, maybe 22. I've got 31. So you need to move 9, 10 animals before prices drop any further, which they will, because every other rancher in the county is doing the same math I'm doing right now. He was quiet for a moment. I know a buyer in Billings, not the stockyards, a private buyer, runs a feedlot operation. He pays better than market price because he doesn't have to deal with the auction fees. I could send a wire. She looked at him. How do you know a private buyer in Billings? Worked with him in Wyoming. He's square. She turned it over. Private buyers were either good or they were trouble, and the difference was entirely in whether you had someone who could vouch for them. Send the wire, she said. He sent it Monday. The reply came back Thursday, and Dan Calloway held it for her at the Mercantile because she didn't have a telegraph office on the property. The buyer was offering $14 a head for 8 to 12 animals delivered to the Harlan Rail Depot by the end of the month. It was $2 above the current auction price. It would cover the hay she needed and leave enough to make November's mortgage payment and have a thin margin besides. She sent back a reply through Dan Calloway. 10 head, end of month. Done. Dan Calloway charged her 15 cents for the use of his telegraph connection and looked at her with something that was almost respect. You're managing better than folks expected, he said. She picked up her change from the counter. I don't know what folks expected. Well, he stacked the coins neatly out of habit. Some figured the ranch would be sold off by August. She looked at him. "Did you figure that?" A pause. "I thought it was possible," he said, which was honest, and she couldn't hold honesty against a person. "It's not going to be sold," she said. "Not while I'm standing on it." She walked out into the October street and stood for a moment in the weak afternoon sun and felt something that was almost anger and almost something more complicated. The particular feeling of having your capability doubted by people who should have known better, mixed with the uncomfortable awareness that their doubts had not been entirely unreasonable. She was still standing on it. That was what mattered. Awesome. Moving 10 head of cattle to the depot required help. This was simply a fact, not a character failing, and she'd gotten better at distinguishing between those two categories over the course of the summer. Colt came on the Saturday before the delivery, and James came too, on the young mare that he'd been working with for 2 months and could now handle reliably in open country. The three of them moved the selected animals out of the main herd in the early morning and drove them the 8 miles to Harlan in a loose group, Colt on the lead, Evelyn on the flank, James bringing up the rear with a focused intensity that made him look older than 10. The buyer's man was waiting at the depot with a rail car already arranged. He counted the cattle twice, checked them over, and paid her in cash, $140 in bills that she folded twice and put in the inside pocket of her coat and kept her hand near for the entire ride home. It was more cash than she'd had at one time since before her father's illness. On the ride back, James pulled his horse up alongside hers and said, without preamble, "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" It was not quite a question. She looked at him, this boy with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and the rope coiled over his saddle horn, and thought about what an honest answer sounded like. "For this winter," she said. "Yeah, I think so. And after? After we figure out as we get there." He was quiet for a moment. That's what Papa always said. He was right about that part. James nodded, like something had been confirmed, and pulled his horse back to the rear position, and Evelyn rode home with $140 folded against her ribs and the particular solemnity of a small victory in a long fight. October turned into November, the way winter progressed in Montana. Not incrementally, but in lurches, each cold snap worse than the last, the sky going from the pale blue of fall to the iron gray of serious winter in a matter of days. Snow came the first week of November, light but determined, and stayed. The ranch contracted the way ranches did in winter. The cattle came in close to the barn. The children stayed near the house. The perimeter of daily life shrank to what was essential, and everything beyond that waited. Colt still came on Saturdays. The work changed. Less fence repair and water management, more firewood and barn maintenance and weatherproofing. He'd start at the woodpile, and sometimes James would work beside him while Evelyn handled the indoor work, and she'd look out the window and see the two of them in the cold, James learning to split wood with an axe that was still slightly too big for him, Colt showing him the stance and the angle of the swing with the patient repetition of a man who understood that teaching something right the first time was easier than fixing it later. He stayed for supper on Saturdays now, reliably, without it needing to be offered every time. Clara set a place for him the same way she set places for the rest of them, which was its own kind of statement, though nobody made anything of it. The children had settled into a relationship with him that Evelyn watched carefully and couldn't find fault with. He was not trying to be their father. He never overreached that line, never positioned himself as an authority he hadn't earned. He was simply present, available, the kind of adult who answers questions seriously and shows up when he says he will, which was, she'd come to understand, rarer than it ought to be. She was the one who couldn't settle. The thing Clara had named in the kitchen, "I think you're allowed to like him," had grown into something she couldn't manage as easily as she managed the ranch accounts. She was used to managing things. She was good at it. She took a problem and broke it into components and addressed each component in order of urgency. And if she did that consistently enough, the problem eventually resolved itself. This was not a problem that broke into components. She liked him. She had liked him since sometime in August, and she'd been handling the fact of it the way she handled most inconvenient facts, by noting it and moving on, by keeping the practical demands of the day between herself and the things she didn't want to examine too closely. What she was less equipped to handle was the growing suspicion that he felt the same way. It was in small things. The way he positioned himself when they were working side by side, always slightly angled toward her rather than away, the way he tracked her in a room without appearing to track her, never staring, never making it obvious, but she was a woman who paid attention, and she could feel the attention paid back. The way he lingered on Saturday evenings, just a few minutes longer than necessary before putting on his coat, like he was looking for a reason to stay. She told herself it didn't matter what he felt. Their situation was what it was. She was a woman with 4 dependents and a struggling ranch, and he was a hired hand at someone else's spread with no particular security himself, and whatever he felt or she felt was not the issue. The issue was the cattle and the mortgage and the winter. She told herself this several times a week. It didn't work as well as she would have liked. The conversation happened on a Saturday evening in the middle of November, when it was dark by 5 o'clock and the snow was coming down steadily outside the kitchen windows, and the children had been put to bed early because the cold made them sleepy. She and Colt were at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, which was where they ended up most Saturday evenings now, going through the week's accounting with 2 cups of coffee and the fire burning down to coals. It had become the closest thing she had to a partnership these evenings. The 2 of them with their heads bent over the numbers, her explaining what she'd done and why, him asking questions that were almost always exactly the right questions. The numbers that night were not good. The hay she'd bought with the cattle sale money was going faster than she'd planned, because the November cold had come earlier and harder than the average year, and the cattle were burning more energy keeping warm. She'd need another load by January, possibly before, and she was already running the math on where that money would come from. She said this out loud, not particularly to him, but to the room, which was what she did when she was working through something. Thought aloud and let the words tell her what she actually believed. I could sell the silver candlesticks, she said, and my mother's good china. I've been holding on to them, but don't. She looked up. He was looking at the ledger, not at her, but there was something in his voice that was different from his usual measured tone. Why not? She asked. Because once you sell them, they're gone. And a year from now, when things are steadier, you'll want them back and you won't be able to have them. A year from now, I need to get to first. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've got money saved. She looked at him steadily. No. Evelyn, no. Her voice was flat. I'm not taking your savings, Colt. It's not charity. I'd want it paid back. It doesn't matter what you'd want. I'm not doing it. She looked back at the ledger. I'll sell the china. It's just china. The silence that followed was different from their usual silence, heavier. She could feel him looking at her, and she kept her eyes on the ledger, running the numbers again as if they might change. You don't have to do everything the hardest possible way, he said. She looked up. I'm not being stubborn for the sake of it, she said. I'm being careful. There's a difference. If I take your money, then I owe you. And if something goes wrong, I'm not going anywhere. You don't know that. I know it well enough. They looked at each other across the table, across the open ledger with its columns of numbers, and the fire snapped once in the hearth and sent a brief light across his face. You don't trust that, he said. Not an accusation, just a statement of what was true. She didn't say anything for a moment. I trusted that my parents would be here, she said finally. I trusted that we'd have a good summer and the cattle would be fat going into fall. I trusted that Pete Larkin would stay and help me figure things out. She closed the ledger. I've stopped putting a lot of weight on what I think I know. He was quiet, looking at her with that steady look that she'd come to know better than she'd intended. That's not trust, he said. That's just fear wearing trust's name. The words landed somewhere she didn't have a defense for. She felt them settle, and felt the small involuntary flinch that comes when something true touches something sore. Maybe, she said. Evelyn. She looked at him, and whatever he'd been holding back for the past 4 months, whatever he'd been managing and measuring and keeping on the correct side of the line, she could see it crossing his face now, could see the decision being made in real time, the moment a careful man decides to stop being careful. I'm not here because the fence needed fixing, he said. You know that? She didn't answer. I've been trying not to say anything, because you've got enough weight on you without me adding to it, and I know the timing is... He stopped, tried again. I know this isn't the time. I know that, but I'm also not going to sit here and pretend I don't. He exhaled slowly. I I don't know what you want from me. I don't know if you want anything from me at all, but I needed you to know it's not just the fence." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at the closed ledger, at the fire, at her hands on the table. "It's not just the fence for me either," she said. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, almost too quiet, but the kitchen was small and he heard them. He didn't move, didn't say anything immediately, and she was glad of that. Glad that he had the sense to let a thing that had just been said exist in the air for a moment before rushing to do something with it. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay," she said. He stopped. Something moved through his expression that was not quite the beginning of a smile and was not quite relief, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "I don't know what comes next. Neither do I." She looked at him. "I can't promise you anything right now. I can't. There are 4 people in this house who depend on me, and the ranch is barely making it through winter, and I don't have any room for—" She stopped, reorganized. "I don't know how to do this and do everything else at the same time. I'm not asking you to figure it all out tonight. I know. I'm just saying I'd like the chance to be—" He seemed to be choosing the word with care. "More than just the man who fixed your fence." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was burning low, and the snow was still falling outside, and somewhere above them Clara was probably awake and listening, because Clara always knew when something was happening. "Come back next Saturday," she said. "I'll be here." "And the Saturday after?" "Yes." She stood up and took his coffee cup and hers to the dry sink, and she heard him push his chair back and reach for his coat, and she didn't turn around while he put it on, because she needed a moment that wasn't under anyone's eyes, even his. "Evelyn." She turned. He was at the door, coat on, hat in hand. He was looking at her with that expression she'd seen Clara try to name, like the most interesting thing he'd ever seen, and this time she let herself look back at it directly instead of looking away. "I mean it," he said, "about not going anywhere." "I know you mean it," she said. "That's the part that scares me." He nodded like that made sense to him, which it probably did. Then he put his hat on and went out into the snow, and she stood in the kitchen and listened to his horse moving down the lane until the sound faded into the winter dark. She sat back down at the table. The ledger was still there. The numbers were still what they were. She opened it again. She had a ranch to keep alive. But she was aware, and in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be before, of the particular quality of a house when someone has just left it. The shape of the empty chair, the faint smell of wood smoke and cold air that came in when the door opened, the way the room had arranged itself differently while he was in it, and was only now rearranging back. She was aware of it, and she let herself be aware of it. That, for tonight, was enough. The snow kept falling through the night and into Sunday, and by morning it had buried the yard in 8 inches of new white, and the children woke to it with the particular joy that children reserved for weather that made the world unrecognizable. Even James, who'd been trying so hard to be serious and adult, stood at the kitchen door in his socks and looked out at the white world and said, "Can we go out?" In a voice that was entirely 10 years old, and Evelyn said yes before she'd even thought about it, because some mornings the firewood and the cattle and the ledger could wait 20 minutes. She watched them from the window, Clara standing at the edge of the porch with her arms crossed, refusing to get her boots wet, but smiling at the twins who were already face down in the snow laughing, James running at a full sprint and launching himself into the deepest drift against the fence, coming up snow-covered and grinning. She put her hand against the cold glass of the window. She thought about what Colt had said. That's not trust. That's just fear wearing trust's name. She'd been calling it caution. She'd been calling it responsibility and careful management and making sure she didn't risk more than she could afford to lose. All of those things were true, but they were also, under examination, just another way of saying she was afraid. And she had been afraid for so long and in so many directions that she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. She watched James climb out of the snowdrift and shake himself off like a dog, and run at another one, and she thought about the spring they'd found in the east pasture, cold and clear, and there the whole time, underground, waiting to be found. She thought about that for a while. Then she went and put on her boots and her coat and went outside, because the cattle needed feeding regardless of how much snow had fallen, and the morning wasn't going to wait for her to finish thinking. She walked out into the white yard, and the cold hit her face, and Samuel saw her coming and ran at her full tilt, and she caught him with both arms, and they both nearly went down in the snow, and she heard herself laugh, a real laugh, not the tired functional version she'd been managing lately, but a laugh that came from somewhere genuine. She set him down. "Cold," she announced. "It's not cold," Samuel informed her with great authority. "It's wonderful." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. He ran off, satisfied with whatever that exchange had been, and she stood in the snow-covered yard of her parents' ranch with the cold biting at her cheeks and the children's voices bright and carrying in the winter air, and she let herself feel for just a moment the small, stubborn warmth of something that had survived everything the year had thrown at it and was still, improbably, burning. It wasn't certainty. She didn't have certainty. She might not have it for years, and she'd stopped pretending that certainty was a thing the world owed her. But it was something. It was real. She went to feed the cattle. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. The winter settled in around the ranch like a long gray argument, and they worked through it the way people worked through things in that territory, one day at a time, without much drama, because drama was a luxury, and they didn't have room for it. The hay held. The cattle held. The mortgage payment in December came in $50 short, and Dan Calloway at the savings bank granted a 2-week extension without being asked twice, which she took as a small mercy and did not overthink. Between her and Colt, the thing that had been named on the November evening existed now in the open. It changed things, and it didn't change things. He was still the man who came on Saturdays and split wood and taught James things and drank her coffee and sat across the ledger from her in the evenings. But there was something different in the way they moved around each other. Less carefully, less like people managing a distance they weren't sure they should close. He touched her shoulder once when he was leaving, just briefly, and she didn't pull away. And neither of them made anything of it, and that was enough for a while. The children noticed, the way children always notice things that adults believed they were hiding. Clara said nothing, which meant she approved. James seemed unbothered, which she'd been less sure of. The twins were entirely focused on a project involving snow and the henhouse that she decided not to examine too closely. December ran deep and cold and relentless, and January came in worse, and that was when the real trouble started. The letter arrived on a Thursday in the second week of January, folded inside an envelope with the bank's name printed on it in businesslike black ink. Dan Calloway handed it to her across the mercantile counter with a careful expression, and she knew before she opened it that it wasn't good news, because good news didn't come in envelopes from banks. She read it standing at the counter. The Harlan County Savings Bank was calling in the remainder of the note on the Hart Ranch property. Not the monthly payment, the whole note. $340, less what she'd paid, which came to $280, due in full by the 1st of March. The reason given was a change in the bank's ownership and a review of outstanding loans considered at risk of default. She read it twice. She folded it back into the envelope and put it in her coat pocket and said thank you to Dan Calloway and walked outside. She stood on the main street of Harlan in the January cold with the letter in her pocket and did the math that she already knew the answer to. $280. She had $23. The cattle sale in October had covered the hay and the October and November payments. December had taken the last of the margin. She had $23 and a ranch and 4 children and 6 weeks before the bank would move to take the property. She stood in the cold for a long time. Then she got in the wagon and drove home. She didn't tell anyone that night. She made supper. She put the children to bed. She sat at the table with the letter in front of her and a candle burning down beside it, and she let herself look at the full shape of it without flinching away. That was one thing she'd learned in the past year, that looking at a bad thing directly was better than looking around it, because what you imagined in the corners was always worse than what was actually there. What was actually there was bad enough. $280. 6 weeks. $23 in the tin on the shelf. She could sell everything that remained of her mother's good things. The silver candlesticks, the china, the embroidered tablecloth, the small oval portrait in the gilt frame that had come across from Massachusetts when her grandparents were young. She'd been holding on to these things because Colt had said, once you sell them, they're gone. And he'd been right, but gone was better than losing the ranch outright. She estimated the value of all of it at somewhere between $40 and $60, depending on who was buying and how desperate she looked when she sold. That left over $200 she didn't have and couldn't see a clear way to get. She sat with this for a long time. The candle burned down to a stub. Outside, the January wind moved across the roof in low, drawn-out sounds that she'd grown up hearing and had never found threatening until this winter, when every sound the house made seemed to be asking how much longer she intended to hold on. She went to bed without having solved it. This was new for her. Going to bed with a problem unsolved was something she'd always resisted, always pushed through another hour of thinking to avoid. But she'd learned, slowly and against her nature, that some problems didn't yield to more thinking. Some problems needed daylight. She told Colt on Saturday. She waited until the children were occupied. The twins in the yard, despite the cold, Clara in the back room with her almanac, James at the barn with the mare. And then she put the letter on the table in front of him and waited while he read it. He read it once. Then he turned it over as if there might be something useful on the back, which there wasn't. Then he set it down. "New bank ownership," he said. "That's what they're saying." "You believe that?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are men in this territory who buy up paper on struggling properties and call the notes in when the weather gets hard, because they know people can't pay and they want the land." He was looking at the letter, not at her. "You know who bought the bank?" She hadn't thought to ask. "No." "Might be worth knowing." She filed that away. "It doesn't change the number." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the table on either side of the letter, looking at it like a man taking stock of a situation before he committed to a direction. She knew that look. She'd come to know most of his looks. "I've got $212 saved," he said. She started to speak. "Let me finish," he said, and something in his voice stopped her, not sharply, but firmly, the way he handled things that needed to be handled without room for argument. "I've been saving since Wyoming. I've got no debts and no dependents and nowhere I need to spend it. It's sitting in a bank in Billings doing nothing." "Colt, $212 and your 23 gets you to 235. You're still 45 short, but that's a different problem than 280. $45 we can find." She looked at him. "That's everything you have." "I know what it is. If something happens, if the ranch fails anyway, if the bank doesn't accept partial, then we figure that out when it happens." "We." She noticed the word. She thought he noticed that she noticed it, because something shifted slightly in his expression. "I can't take your savings," she said. "It's not about pride this time. It's about, if I take everything you have and this doesn't work, I've taken everything you have. And if you lose the ranch because you wouldn't let me help you, what have I got?" He was looking at her steadily. "Evelyn, what am I going to do with $200 in a Billings bank account? Buy a horse I don't need?" She looked at the letter. She looked at the number. "It would be a loan," she said. "Written down. With interest." "Fine, write it down." "I mean it. This is business." "Write it down," he said again, and the slight emphasis on the second word told her he was willing to let her call it whatever she needed to call it. She got up and found paper and a pen, and she wrote it down. The amount, the date, the terms, 4% interest, repayment to begin when the ranch returned to solvency. She slid it across the table, and he read it and signed his name at the bottom, and then she signed hers. She looked at the paper, at his signature next to hers. "Thank you," she said. He folded his copy and put it in his breast pocket. "Don't thank me yet. We're still $45 short. I'll sell the candlesticks." "How much will you get?" 20, maybe 25. That's still 20 short." "I know." She picked up the letter and folded it. "I'll talk to Calloway at the feed store. I've been buying from him since I was a girl, and Thomas before me. He owes us credit." "And if he won't extend it?" She looked out the window at the January yard, at the twins making something complicated in the snow, at the barn where James was working with the mare, at the smoke coming from the chimney of the house her father had built and her mother had died in, and which was, for 6 more weeks, still hers. "Then I'll find another way," she said. "I always do." The feed store credit came through on Monday. Ed Briggs, who ran the feed store and had the blunt manner of a man who'd been cheated enough times that he'd stopped softening his rejections, looked at her across his counter for a long moment, and then said he'd carry $20 for 30 days, and if she didn't pay it, he'd add it to the Hart family account that had been running for 15 years and collect it with the rest. She walked out of the feed store with the credit arranged and added it in her head and came up with $255, which was still 25 short of what she needed. She stood on the street and did the inventory of what was left to sell. Her mother's portrait. She hadn't included it before because she'd been holding the line there, had been telling herself she would not sell the portrait, that the portrait was not negotiable. She looked at the number in her head and looked at the line she'd drawn and understood that the line was going to have to move. She went home and wrapped the portrait in a cloth and drove back to Harlan and sold it to the dry goods owner's wife, who had admired it once and paid $30 for it without haggling, and Evelyn drove home with $30 and no portrait and sat in the wagon outside the house for several minutes before she went in. It was a painting. It was not her mother. She knew this. It didn't make the space on the wall where it had hung look any better. She had $285, $5 more than she needed. She went to the Harlan County Savings Bank on Wednesday morning with the money in an envelope and her copy of the letter in her coat pocket, and she sat across from the new bank manager, a man named Aldous Cray, recently arrived from somewhere east, with a banker's suit and a banker's manner, and the practiced pleasantness of a man who is comfortable with other people's difficulty. She put the envelope on the desk. "Full payment of the outstanding note," she said, "plus the January installment." He looked at the envelope. He opened it, counted the bills carefully, and then counted them again, and wrote something in the ledger on his desk. "Miss Hart," he said, "this is, He paused, and she watched him recalibrate. "This is satisfactory? I'd like a receipt." "Of course." While he wrote the receipt, she looked at the office around her. New furniture, recently installed. The nameplate on the desk was too shiny, not worn enough to have been there long. She thought about what Colt had said. There are men who buy up paper on struggling properties. And she thought about the timing of this new ownership and the call letter arriving in January, in the hardest part of winter when ranchers had the least cash. She took a receipt and folded it and put it in her coat pocket next to the letter. "Mr. Cray," she said, "is there any reason to expect the terms of the remaining note to change?" He met her eyes. There was something in his that she couldn't quite read. A flatness, maybe, or the careful blankness of a man who was used to concealing his calculations. "The remaining note will be honored per its original terms," he said, "provided payments continue as scheduled." She stood up. "They will." She walked out of the bank into the January cold and stood on the street and breathed. The ranch was still hers. For now. Provisionally. Contingent on things continuing to go right in a world that had not, in her recent experience, been particularly interested in things going right. But hers today, which was the only day she was responsible for right now. She drove home faster than she should have on the icy road because she wanted to get back before the children wondered where she was. She told Colt that Saturday. He was at the woodpile when she came out to find him, splitting logs in the January cold with the particular economical rhythm that meant he'd been doing it long enough that it required no thought. He stopped when he saw her face. "It's done," she said, "paid in full." He set the axe down against the block. He didn't say anything, but something moved through his expression. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a tension he'd been holding so quietly she hadn't fully seen it until it left him. "Good," he said. "Colt." She stopped a few feet from him, and the cold was sharp on her face, and she didn't particularly care. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He nodded once. "I've been managing this ranch by myself for almost a year," she said. "And I've been managing everything else too. The children, the money, the town, all of it. And I got very good at doing things alone because I had to, and because I believed that needing help was the first step toward losing everything." She paused. "I know that's not entirely true. I've known it since probably August. But knowing something and doing something about it are different things, and I've been slow." She watched him watching her. "You didn't treat me like a problem to be solved," she said. "You didn't treat me like I needed rescuing. You just showed up and kept showing up. And I kept waiting for you to want something back for it, and you never did. And that scared me more than if you had." He was very still. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I've never—" "Thomas Whitfield asked to court me when I was 17, and I turned him down because I was afraid he'd change the way things were. And then things changed anyway. Everything changes anyway." She exhaled. "I'm tired of being afraid of the things that might actually be good." The woodpile stood between them, half-split logs scattered across the snow. The smoke from the chimney went straight up in the cold air, which meant the wind had died, and the ranch was very quiet around them. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said. "I don't need you to fix anything. But if you meant what you said in November, I meant it. Then I'd like—" She stopped, found the words. "I'd like to stop pretending we're something less than what we are." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and she stood her ground, which she would always do. It was simply her nature. And when he took her face in both hands, rough, cold hands, working hands, and looked at her for a moment before he kissed her, she was aware of the particular sensation of having been seen completely by another person and not having run from it. It was not a long kiss. It was not particularly graceful. Her nose was cold, and she made an involuntary sound against his mouth that was embarrassingly close to a laugh. And he pulled back and looked at her, and then smiled, a real smile. The first full one she'd seen from him, and it changed his whole face. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She was smiling too, which felt strange on her face, like a muscle she'd forgotten she had. "My nose is cold." "Your nose is always cold. It's January." Fair point. They stood there in the cold yard, and she was aware that if Clara was at the back window, she was certainly watching, and she found she didn't particularly mind. She told the children that evening, not in any formal way. There was nothing formal to tell yet, no announcement to make, no settled arrangement. She sat them at the kitchen table after supper and said that she and Colt had become, she looked for the word, important to each other, and that she wanted them to know. Clara looked unsurprised, which was entirely characteristic. James looked at the table for a moment, and then at Evelyn, and then said, "Is he going to live here? We haven't talked about that." "But maybe?" "Maybe," she said. "We'll talk about it together. All of us." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He taught me to rope." "I know. And how the pump works." "I know that too." James nodded slowly, the way he processed things. "Okay," he said. In his particular economy of words, this was the equivalent of a speech. Nora asked if Colt would be there for Christmas, and Evelyn gently pointed out that Christmas had already passed, and Nora said that was fine. He could be there for the next one, and that was apparently the extent of her concern. Samuel asked if he could have more pie. She cut him more pie. That night, after the house was quiet, she sat at the table with the ledger one more time. The numbers had not magically improved. The ranch was still carrying debt, still dependent on the coming spring going well, still vulnerable to the dozen things that could go wrong in cattle country in any given year. But the mortgage note was paid. The cattle were alive. The hay was holding. The children were fed and sleeping, and as far as she could tell, all right in the complicated way that children were all right when they'd survived hard things. She closed the ledger. February came in with a cold that made January feel mild. The temperature dropped to the kind of numbers that made outdoor work dangerous if you weren't careful about it. And Evelyn was very careful, because she couldn't afford to be otherwise. She organized the days around the cold, the necessary outdoor work done in the warmer middle hours, everything else managed inside. The fire kept burning day and night because the alternative was pipes freezing and cattle in distress, and a set of problems she had no capacity to add. Colt came every Saturday and now sometimes on weekday evenings, riding the 8 miles from the Double H in the dark after his work was done and staying for supper and leaving before too late, which was all of them navigating the particular protocol of something that wasn't fully defined yet. She didn't mind the undefinedness. She'd spent a year operating in conditions that were undefined, and she'd learned that you could live in the space between what was and what was going to be if you had to. The children adapted to his increased presence with the practicality of children who'd had to adapt to many things and had developed a kind of institutional flexibility as a result. Even James, who she'd worried about most, seemed to have settled into a version of acceptance that was not forced and not performed. He talked to Colt differently than he talked to most adults, more directly. less defensively. And she watched this sometimes and felt something she didn't try to name, because naming it would require her to think about the future in ways that still felt dangerous. It was on an evening in mid-February, when the temperature outside was punishing and the house was warm and the children were in various stages of settling toward bed, that Colt said the thing he'd been carrying around for a while. She could tell he'd been carrying it because of the particular way he was sitting, not his usual loose, settled posture at the kitchen table, but something slightly more taut, the way a person sits when they're waiting for the right moment to say something and are not entirely sure the right moment is going to arrive on its own. She waited for it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything about where I stand." She put down the mending she'd been working on. "All right," she said. He looked at her directly. "Marry me." The kitchen was quiet. The fire popped once. "That's not a question," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." A beat. "Marry me, Evelyn." She looked at him, at the man who had ridden past her fence line and stopped because he couldn't not stop, who had fixed things without being asked and shown up without being invited and put $212 on her kitchen table without hesitating, who had talked to her brother like he was worth talking to and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. She also looked at what she knew of him, which was not everything. There were whole years of his life she only knew in outline, a Wyoming ranch and a sister somewhere he'd mentioned once and then not again, things that a person carried that hadn't been given words yet. He was not a simple man. He had a temper she'd seen surface twice, both times at something genuinely worth being angry at, and both times he'd managed it, but she'd seen it. He was stubborn in the particular way that made him refuse to let a problem beat him, which was useful and would also, she suspected, be difficult. He was not a perfect man. She was not a perfect woman. She was sharp-edged and proud, and she found asking for help genuinely painful, and she sometimes went 3 days without really talking to anyone because she got inside her own head and forgot that other people were useful. "You know what you're asking," she said. "It's not just me. I know that. There are 4 of them, and they've already lost 2 parents, and if you're going to be—" She stopped. "If you're going to be in this, you're in it. You don't get to decide later it was more than you thought." "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I've been thinking about it since October." She looked at him. "October," she said. "Around the time of the cattle sale, when James rode the drive with us." He was steady, looking at her without looking away. "He handled himself out there, and you handled the buyer without blinking, and I rode home that night and thought, I want to be part of this, not as the man who fixed the fence, as someone who stays." The fire burned. The wind moved along the eaves outside. She thought about her father's grave, out behind the house, next to her mother's. She thought about the spring underground that had always been there, waiting. She thought about all the things she'd thought she couldn't afford to want. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, more certainly. "But I want to talk to the children first before anything else. They need to be part of this decision." "Of course. And the ranch stays in my name." He blinked. "I wasn't going to—" "I know. I'm saying it anyway. It was Thomas Hart's ranch, and it's mine now, and it will stay that way on paper." A pause, and then something that might have been the beginning of that rare, full smile. "All right? And you're going to have to talk to James yourself, not me, you." "Fair enough." She looked at her hands on the table, then at him. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I want you to know that." "I noticed." He said it without any particular inflection, which somehow made it better than if he had argued. "I'm still here?" "You've been here on Saturdays. That's different from all the rest of the days." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not under any illusions about what this is. Hard land, hard winters, 4 kids, more debt than comfort. I know what I'm choosing." "Why?" She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out of somewhere deeper than she'd intended. "Why would you choose this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you're worth choosing," he said. "The whole thing. All of it. You and the kids and the debt and the land." He paused. "I'd rather have this, the real thing, hard as it is, than anything easier somewhere else." She sat with that. "James is going to ask you hard questions," she said finally. "I expect so." And Clara is going to watch everything you do for the next 6 months and make up her mind in her own time. That's her right. She exhaled. Okay. Okay, yes? Okay, yes, she said. Okay, we'll get married. She stood up and went to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the February dark, at the snow that had been coming down all day and was still coming, covering the yard in another layer of white. The ranch was out there under the snow. The barn, the fence lines, the cattle huddled in the shelter she'd built for them. The spring in the east pasture cold and underground and reliable. She heard him stand up behind her. She didn't turn around. Colt, she said. Yeah. I need you to know something too. She was still looking at the window. I'm not marrying you because the bank called in the note and I needed someone to save the ranch. I could have found another way. I've been finding other ways since February. I know that. I'm marrying you because... She stopped, tried again. Because I spent a year proving I could do it alone, and then I met you and I stopped wanting to. She turned around. That's why. He was standing a few feet away, and she couldn't quite read his expression in the firelight, but she didn't need to. She'd gotten to know him well enough in the past months that she could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying, and she didn't need it put into words. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Outside, the snow came down on the Hart Ranch, on the graves and the barn and the fence lines and the cold underground spring, and covered everything in the particular blank mercy of a Montana winter night. And inside the fire burned and the children slept, and two people stood in a kitchen in the middle of an unlikely thing and were not afraid of it. Not entirely, but enough. She told the children on a Sunday morning. She gathered them at the kitchen table the way she gathered them for anything important. Not dramatically, not with preamble, just come sit down, I need to talk to you. And she told them plainly that Colt had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes, and that nothing would be decided or done until they had all talked about it together. Clara sat with her hands folded on the table and said nothing, which meant she was thinking. The twins looked at each other in that particular way they had, conducting some private communication that no one else had ever fully decoded. And then Nora said, "Will he be our father?" And the question landed in the room with the particular weight of 6-year-old directness. Evelyn looked at her. "He won't replace your father," she said carefully. "But he would be part of the family, in a permanent way." "Like a father," Nora said, insisting on the word. "Yes," Evelyn said, "like a father." James had not said anything yet. He was sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, not in the defensive way, but in the contained way. The way he held himself when he was feeling something he wasn't sure he had permission to feel. "James," she said. He looked up. "Say what you're thinking." He was quiet for another moment, then, "Is this because of the bank? Because of the money?" "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She held his eyes. "I could have found the money another way. I would have." He looked at the table, then back up. "He's been here all winter," he said. "Fixing things, teaching me stuff." A pause. "He didn't have to do any of that." "No," she said. He didn't. James was quiet for another long moment, doing the 10-year-old version of cost-benefit analysis that he'd been conducting, she suspected, for months. Then he uncrossed his arms and put his hands flat on the table, which was, for James, something close to an open gesture. "I want to talk to him," he said. "By myself." "That can happen," she said, "before you decide anything final." "Yes." He nodded. Then he stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard, and she watched his back and thought about the boy he'd been a year ago. Softer around the edges, more careless, still a child in the way children are children before the world interrupts. And the boy he was now, which was something harder-edged and more watchful, but also, she thought, more real. The year had cost him something, but it had also given him something, and she couldn't always tell where the cost ended and the gift began. Clara spoke then. "I think it's right," she said simply. Everyone looked at her. "I've been watching him since July," she said, with the composure of a person who had clearly formed her opinion months ago and was only now being asked to share it. "He's patient. He doesn't make promises he doesn't keep. He talks to us like we have sense." She paused. "Mama would have liked him." Evelyn felt that one in her sternum. "Thank you, Clara," she said. Samuel, who had been quiet for an unusually long time, said, "Can we have a dog? If he moves in, can we get a dog?" The room released something. Not quite laughter, but the pressure that had been sitting in it, and Evelyn put her hand over her eyes briefly and then said, "We'll discuss the dog." Colt came that afternoon. She sent the others inside and stood at the fence with him and told him James wanted to talk to him alone, and he said all right, and that was the whole conversation about it. He didn't ask what he should say or how he should handle it. He just went and found James in the barn, and she watched from the kitchen window, hands on the sill, the way she'd watched him work all those months ago when she'd been trying to convince herself she wasn't paying attention. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She didn't know what was said. She never asked James, and she never asked Colt, because it belonged to them, and some things needed to belong to people without anyone else's eyes on them. When James came back inside, he went straight to the back room without saying anything. She gave him 20 minutes and then knocked on the door frame. "Yeah," he said. She went in and sat on the edge of the bed and waited. "He said he's not trying to be Papa," James said finally. "He said he knows he can't be, and he's not going to try. He was looking at the ceiling. He said he just wants to be someone I can count on, if I want." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." A pause. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" James sat up. He looked at her with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and 12 months of hard living behind them both. "I think he means it," he said. "He's not. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. I've noticed that." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't." "Okay," James said. The same word he'd used before with the same weight. Whole paragraphs compressed into a single syllable. She put her hand on the back of his neck briefly, the way she'd done since he was small. "Okay," she said back. They were married on a Saturday in March, when the snow was starting to pull back from the south-facing slopes, and the first tentative suggestion of spring was in the angle of the afternoon light. It was not a large wedding. The justice of the peace from Harlan came out to the ranch because Evelyn didn't want to do it in town under everyone's eyes. And the Calloway family came because they'd been there through the worst of it, and it seemed right. Old Pete Larkin had come back from Billings the month before. His sister recovered, Pete himself looking thinner but intact, and he stood at the back of the small gathering in the yard with his hat in his hands and his eyes bright. Evelyn wore her mother's green dress, which she'd let out at the waist and taken in at the shoulders to fit her changed body, a year of hard work having rearranged things significantly from the shape the dress was cut for. She hadn't had time to do the alterations perfectly, and there was a place at the left side seam that pulled slightly when she breathed deep. She'd noticed it getting dressed that morning and decided she didn't care. The dress was her mother's, and she was wearing it. Colt wore his good shirt, which was clean and pressed, and not particularly different from his other shirts, but had clearly been given attention. She noticed his hands when he took hers, the same rough, work-hardened hands that had fixed her fence and her pump and her barn hinge and put $200 on her table without blinking. And she held on to them and said the words the justice read to her. The children stood in a row beside her, Clara composed, James still and serious, the twins holding hands because they always held hands. When it was done, Samuel asked loudly if there was going to be cake, and there was, because Clara had made one the day before, and the small wedding in the March yard dissolved into the more manageable business of eating cake in the kitchen with people who'd come to wish them well. Pete Larkin pulled her aside near the end and said, "Your folks would be glad," and she thanked him and looked away quickly because she was not going to cry at her own wedding when there was still cake to be distributed. She didn't cry. She was not sure in the years afterward whether that was a strength or a failure, but it was what happened. Spring came the way it always did, with mud and work, and the cattle needing to move to fresh grass, and the fence lines needing checking after the winter's abuse. But it came to a different ranch than the one that had faced the previous spring. Colt moved his few possessions into the house. A bedroll, a toolbox, 2 changes of clothes, 3 books that she hadn't expected and asked him about. He said he'd always read when he could find anything worth reading. She added his 3 books to the shelf beside the almanac and the Bible, and thought about how small the evidence of a person's interior life could be when they'd been living lean. He was not easy to share a house with entirely. He had habits she hadn't anticipated, a particular way of leaving his boots that she stepped around for 2 weeks before she said something, and a tendency to go quiet for long stretches when something was bothering him, which left her with the choice of asking or waiting, and she was not naturally inclined toward waiting. They navigated these things imperfectly, which was the only way anyone ever navigated anything real. Once in April, they had an argument that got loud enough that the twins came downstairs to see what was happening, and Evelyn told them to go back to bed, and they did, and she and Colt finished the argument in lower voices that were somehow worse than the loud ones. It was about money. It was almost always about money, specifically about whether to take out a small loan to buy 4 additional head of breeding stock or wait until fall when they'd have more certainty about the spring income. She said wait. He said the opportunity was now or not at all. They did not resolve it that night. She went to bed still certain she was right and woke up at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought about it and acknowledged, in the privacy of the dark where no one could see her acknowledge it, that he had a point. She told him so in the morning, which cost her something real because she was not constitutionally inclined toward changing her position and less inclined toward admitting it. He did not make anything of it. He just said, "We can look at the numbers together," which was exactly the right thing to say. They bought 2 of the 4 animals, a compromise that neither of them had proposed, but that emerged from the space between their positions, which was, she was learning, where most of the workable answers lived. The spring cattle came in well. Better than she'd projected, partly because the winter had been hard enough to thin out the weaker animals and leave the herd stronger overall, and partly because Colt had a particular skill with cattle that was different from her own. She knew the land and the operations and the numbers, and he knew the animals themselves, their patterns and ailments, and the particular language of a healthy herd versus one that was sliding toward trouble. Together they could see things neither of them could see alone. This was the thing she hadn't expected about marriage. Not the comfort of it, not the company. She'd imagined both of those. But the particular advantage of 2 people who were good at different things deciding to apply their different skills to the same set of problems. It was not romantic exactly, but it was real, and it worked, and she thought it might be the most practical argument for marriage she'd ever encountered. She told him this one evening in early June, sitting on the porch while the children ran in the long summer evening light, and he looked at her and said, "That's the least sentimental thing anyone's ever said to me about being married." "Do you want sentimental?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "I'll take real." "Good," she said, "because that's what I've got." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch of the Hart Ranch in the summer evening and watched James teach Samuel to rope while Nora heckled from the fence rail, and Clara sat apart reading, and Evelyn felt the particular quality of a life that was not easy and not perfect, and was, in the way that mattered, enough. More than enough. It was hers. The debt to Colt was paid back in 2 installments, the first in October of 1883, the second the following spring. She put the repayment in his hand with the written record of the loan, cleared and signed, and he took it and looked at it and then put it in the stove. "You don't need that anymore," he said. "I wrote it down so you'd be protected," she said. "I know." He watched the paper catch. "I don't need protecting from you." She looked at the small flame consuming the paper and felt, strangely, something lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully identified as a weight until it was gone. The last formal accounting of what she owed him, reduced to ash. What remained between them after that had no paper to represent it, which meant it was either nothing or it was something that paper wasn't adequate to hold. She was fairly sure it was the latter. The years that followed were not a straight line upward. Anyone who told the story that way would be leaving out the summer of 1884, when a late frost killed half the season's calf crop, and they came into fall with almost nothing and had to borrow against the spring to make it through. Would be leaving out the winter James got pneumonia, and Evelyn sat with him for 9 days straight and did not sleep more than an hour at a time, and bargained with everything she could think to bargain with, and got him back, thin and pale, in the 10th day, and then went out to the barn and stood in the dark for 20 minutes doing the thing she never let anyone see. Would be leaving out the fight she and Colt had in the spring of 1886 that lasted 3 days and left the house with a particular chilly politeness that the children clearly found alarming, and was resolved not because either of them won, but because they were both too stubborn to walk away from a thing they'd chosen and too honest to pretend the other person didn't have a point. The line was not straight, but it moved, generally, in the right direction. By 1887, the Hart Ranch was running 60 head. By 1889, they'd bought the adjacent 12 acres when the Pearson family moved to Oregon, and the cattle operation expanded into the new grass. Colt hired 2 hands for the summer seasons, and Evelyn managed the books and the household and the 4 children who were growing into people faster than she could quite account for. Clara was 17 and had the particular self-possession of a person who had known exactly who she was since the age of 9. She talked about teaching school, which Evelyn thought would suit her, and which Colt said nothing about because he understood which battles were his to have opinions about and which weren't. She left for the teacher's training school in Helena in the fall of 1888 and wrote letters home every 2 weeks that were thorough and unsentimental and exactly like her. James at 15 was a different person than the hollow-eyed boy who had stood in a barn doorway, not knowing how to want anything. He was rangy and capable and completely unintimidated by the land or the cattle or the work, and he talked about running the operation someday with the easy certainty of someone who had already decided and was just waiting for time to catch up. Colt worked alongside him differently now. Less teacher, more equal, and both of them seemed to understand the shift had happened without needing to name it. The twins grew into people who were distinct from each other in a way that surprised everyone who'd known them as small children. Nora was sociable and sharp-tongued and ended up marrying a cattleman from the next valley when she was 20, a choice Evelyn had feelings about that she kept mostly to herself. Samuel stayed. He stayed the way some people stay, not because they couldn't leave, but because the place had gotten into him, and leaving it would require removing something essential, and he didn't see why he'd want to do that. In the spring of 1892, 10 years after Margaret Hart died and left Evelyn standing at 2 graves in the frozen ground, a man named Aldous Cray came to the ranch. She was in the yard when he rode up, and she recognized him immediately. The banker from Harlan who'd sent the letter calling in the note in January of 1883. He was older, his banker's suit no longer new, and he had the look of a man who'd come to do something uncomfortable and was deciding how to begin. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Mr. Cray." She waited. "I don't know if you remember me. I remember you." He got down from his horse. He had a document in his hand. "I'm not with the bank anymore," he said. "Left in '86. I'm with a land development company now, out of Billings." He paused. "We're buying up ranches in this county, consolidating for a larger cattle operation. I've been authorized to make you an offer." She looked at the document he held out. She didn't take it. "The ranch isn't for sale," she said. "Mrs. Brennan, if you'd look at the number doesn't matter." She kept her voice even. "This ranch isn't for sale. It wasn't for sale in 1883 when your bank tried to take it from me, and it isn't for sale now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the house, the expanded barn, the fence lines running clean and true across the property, the cattle visible in the north pasture, at the evidence spread across 43 acres, of 10 years of work that had not broken her. "You've built something here," he said. It sounded almost involuntary. "Yes," she said. "I have. We have." He folded the document and put it in his coat, chapka, and got back on his horse. He tipped his hat, which she thought was audacious under the circumstances, and rode back down the lane. Colt came out of the barn, where he'd clearly been listening. He looked down the lane at the retreating rider. "Offer any good?" he asked. I didn't look at it. He glanced at her. "Evelyn, the ranch isn't for sale." He was quiet for a moment, then, "No," he said, "it's not." They stood in the spring yard together and watched the man from the development company disappear around the bend in the road, and then they went back to work, because there was always work to go back to, and that had never stopped being true, and neither of them had ever wanted it to. What she understood by the time she was 32 years old and had been running the Hart Ranch for a decade in one form or another was something she couldn't have been told at 22 and wouldn't have believed if she had been. That survival was not the same thing as living, but it was the necessary first step, and there was no shortcut through it. You had to go through the part where you were holding things together by main force and willpower and the refusal to admit how close to the edge you were, and you had to go all the way through it, and somewhere on the other side of that was a life that was yours in a way that things easily gotten never quite were. That accepting help was not the same thing as surrender, that the line between pride and self-destruction was thinner than she'd believed, and that the people who couldn't cross it didn't survive long enough to understand what they'd lost by staying on the wrong side. That the man who showed up and kept showing up without requiring anything in return except eventually the chance to stay, that man was not a rescue. She had rescued herself. He was something rarer and harder to name. He was the person you built with, once you'd survived long enough to build. She'd been afraid of that for a long time, afraid that wanting something good made it more likely to be taken away. It was the logic of grief, and it was wrong, but grief didn't care about being wrong. It just settled into you and made itself at home until you decided, deliberately and against your nature, to show it the door. The showing out was not a single moment. It was 100 small moments over months and years. Every time she let Colt know something was hard. Every time James asked a question and she gave him a real answer instead of a managed one. Every time Clara sent a letter from Helena and she wrote back with actual news instead of reassurances. Every time she looked at the numbers in the ledger and said, "This is what we have," instead of "This is what I have." The we was the thing. The we had changed everything. On a September evening in 1892, Evelyn Hart Brennan sat on the porch of her ranch and watched her family move through the last light of the day. James was at the far fence line with one of the hands, working on something she couldn't make out from here. Colt was in the barn, probably longer than he needed to be because he tended to lose track of time in there, which had once been a source of irritation and was now simply a fact she'd incorporated. The twins were... Nora was at her own house in the next valley, and Samuel was somewhere on the property doing something that would eventually need to be explained. Clara was in Helena, teaching school to children who would remember her the way she remembered things, quietly, completely, for the rest of their lives. The sun was going down behind the western mountains, painting the sky in colors that she'd grown up watching and had never gotten tired of, which said something about the persistence of attention when a thing was genuinely beautiful. She sat there with her hands in her lap, not doing anything, which was something she'd had to learn to do. Just sitting, just looking. The ranch spread out around her in the evening light. The barn Colt had helped rebuild with proper boards, the fence lines running true, the north pasture where the cattle were settling for the night, the cottonwoods in the east that marked the spring underground, cold and clear and reliable, that her father had known about and had not been there to show her, and that she'd found anyway. Her father's graves were behind the house, marked with proper stones now, not the rough pine crosses of the first year. She went there sometimes, not as often as she used to. She'd stopped needing to as the years passed, which she thought meant not that she'd forgotten, but that she'd learned how to carry the remembering differently. She heard the barn door and looked over and saw Colt coming across the yard with that walk she knew, as well as her own reflection, unhurried, contained, hands easy at his sides. He came up onto the porch and stood for a moment looking at the same sunset she'd been watching. "James found a section of east fence that needs replacing," he said. "We should get to it before first frost." "I know," she said. "Put it on the list." He sat down in the chair beside hers. They sat there in the evening, not talking, the way they'd gotten comfortable not talking over years of having said enough of the necessary things. After a while, he said, "You all right?" She thought about it. Really thought about it, the way she'd learned to think about questions that deserved real answers. "Yeah," she said, "I'm all right." He nodded. She looked at the ranch and the fading light, at the fence lines and the barn and the pastures and the graves and the cottonwoods and everything that had been fought for and lost and rebuilt and held. The woman who had stood at 2 graves in the frozen ground 10 years ago, alone and 22, and holding herself together with nothing but the refusal to fall apart, that woman was not gone. She was right here. She was the same person, carrying the same stubbornness and the same pride and the same bone-deep love for this specific piece of earth. But she was not holding it alone anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. That was the whole story, really. Not that someone had saved her, not that love had fixed what grief had broken, but that she had done the impossible, brutal work of surviving, and then, when someone worthy of the trust finally showed up and stayed, she had been brave enough, just barely, to let him in. The sun went down behind the mountains. The ranch settled into evening. Evelyn Hart. Brennan sat on her porch and watched the stars appear, one by one, the way they always did. Quietly, without announcement, until suddenly the whole sky was full of them.
I'm getting the fuck out of here, man. Fuck that. Fuck that, fuck that, fuck that, fuck that, fuck that. Ah! Oh, shit. Hey, Shayla. Dude, this gold bar's fucking a million pounds.
Yeah, tell me about it. That's why I didn't even know I grabbed the gold bar at first.
Heavy as a motherfucker. There's a bracken in there. I don't know how I survived.
Holding that shit kind of.
I don't think I can make it over this bridge. I have an idea. I can drop it, jump to the other side, and maybe grab it after that. No!
Are we so dead ass?
You can get up, you can get up, you can get up. Walk this. Walk that way, walk that way. Oh my god. You gotta be fucking serious? Okay, now I know where to go because of Daddy. Oh! I think I lost the gold bar though. That sucks. Well, it's better than everyone being dead. Am I right or am I right? I'm right. I don't need anyone to tell me that.